So, unihia te pō whirimarama, tō mokia te au, gau whatu tangata, tātai ki runga, tātai ki raro, tātai ahoro, haumi e, hui e, tā iki e. From confusion and darkness comes light of understanding. From our understanding comes unity as people. We are interwoven with the below, with what ties us. We are interconnected, allied together as one. Kia ora, I really hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much, JT. Welcome everyone to our fourth of our international webinar series featuring Joshua Pether. I'm Izzy Robinson, the creative producer here at Touch Compass. My pronouns are they, them. I've got a round white face, big black headphones on, my long curly hair tied up in a bun, and I'm wearing a gray shirt. Behind me is the Touch Compass logo. It's my background. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start off. First of all, if during the webinar itself, you're able to keep your microphones on mute, makes it a lot easier. However, in terms of video, please, whether you like your video on or off, go right ahead. We'd love to see all your faces, but understand if you don't want to have your video on. And it's a very relaxed webinar. So if you need to eat, drink, move around, come and go, please do what you need to do to enjoy today. And in terms of our interpretation team, we have two amazing NZSL interpreters from Platform Interpreting. They'll be spotlit for the entirety of the webinar. Every now and then they'll interrupt to swap over and we'll just all take a pause. If you have any issues at all during today's webinar, technical or otherwise, send me a message in the chat or send a message to Zan, whose name is Touch Compass Office, and we will try and fix them as soon as we can. Generally, if you want to post some questions, pop it in the chat. You can send them again anonymously to Zan or myself, or you can post them for everyone to read. And when we get to the end of the webinar, we'll do some Q&A. And at that point, we'd love for everyone to turn their cameras back on and come join in the conversation and ask whatever questions you generate from listening to Joshua. And of course, I'll be able to read aloud any of the questions that get posted in the chat. And Zan will be able to read aloud any questions that get posted on Facebook Live, which this is also co-streaming on right now. I think that's everything. Again, if there's any issues at all, you just let Zan or I know, and we will try and fix them as soon as we can. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Suzanne Cowan, one of our artistic direction panel, to introduce themselves and start us off.
Kia ora. My name's Suzanne. I am a pale-skinned woman with light brown hair. I am of European descent, Irish, Scottish, and English ancestry. I am seated here today in Tamaki, Kōrero, Auckland, and I'm in my apartment. I'm sitting on a green couch, and interestingly, I have a wonderful Aboriginal print behind me that I purchased in Sydney 25 years ago, where I made my brother piggyback me up the steps of a gallery to buy this wonderful lithograph. Just thought this might be relevant to the context. And the artist is Ngāti Maniapoto. I don't know if you have ever heard of her, but I also saw a wonderful exhibition of hers in Christchurch at the art gallery a few years ago, and so that's very exciting. Sorry, I got on a little bit of a tangent there, but I was just excited to share that bit of context. So I'm very excited to be here today with you all, and I'm going to pass you over to Lucy.
Talofa Ahia Pay, Tina Koutau Katoa. Greetings to you all. I am Lucy Faber. I am a Pacific performer with cerebral palsy, and I've got some different verbal abilities to communicate with people with the communication application. I am a light brown skin with black hair and a bun. I'm wearing a light silk shirt with black shaped patterns. I am Samoan with European descent. I've been performing for over 25 years and Turedi with Touch Compass. I went overseas to get further training in dance and contact improvisation workshops. Last year I started to work independently as a collaborator. That's all about me. So I would like to introduce the amazing Joshua Pether from Perth, Australia.
Thank you, Lucy. Hello, everyone. I'm coming at you from the lands of the Wajak Noongar Budja people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. My name is Joshua Pether, and I am a brown-skinned man. I'm wearing glasses, and my hair is fairly short, it's usually shaved. And I'm in my bedroom, and to the left of me you can see my bed, and there's also the loft in that way as well. And I'm wearing a black shirt with this wooden pendant that I wear a lot as well. Yes, so that's me. Yeah.
How does your Indigenous identity inform the work you present? Provocateur, you have been described as. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, provocateur. I think I've probably always potentially been a provocateur, even before I started to do what I did. I've often felt that my presence in a room or even in around people has always provoked some sort of response. It's either been negative or positive. It just depends. And I suppose that's always that sort of thing has always led to, I suppose, the work I've done, which has sort of been provocative in nature. And the Indigeneity aspect of it, I suppose, has always been there, but has never really been something I've necessarily pinned down as being related to the work I do. And I think it was only in probably the last 5 or 6 years that I've sort of realised that the work I do has definitely got elements of our culture in it, embedded in it, particularly with regards to time. I suppose what I see as the practice of what I consider to be ritual in the work that I do, and also just in regards to, I suppose, the outlining aspects of how we perceive work should be. I've got a different viewpoint of that. So all the, I suppose, the elements of like, you know, it starts at here and it ends here, and that's the work. I take a different viewpoint to that sort of aspect of things. Yeah.
How do you design a creation process for your works that honours both your Indigenous and disabled identities, and why is ritual and time important to your work?
Yeah, the creative process is often, to me, can be a collaboration between non-humans and humans. Often the ideas can be sparked by non-human entities. That often does occur. And this often involves long sort of, I suppose, walks and maybe periods of contemplation with myself and a non-human entity about what it is that this work is about. And then trying to then communicate that to your collaborators can sometimes be a bit of a problem when they're not really on that same wavelength or they don't necessarily understand or get at what that is. But there's been collaborators, I think, that I've had that sort of go, oh yeah, I understand what you're talking about, and they've even, you know, had those experiences themselves. And so it doesn't necessarily always end up being too much of a issue for them. But I suppose going back to the question, how the work is constructed, for me, it comes a lot from personal experience. And rather than, like, the last work I did was very personal work. And rather than sort of telling the story of what happened and, like, you know, this is what happened, these people did this sort of thing and so forth, I like to be a bit more abstract with what that is, and then leave that up to audiences' interpretation. And it's quite interesting to read the reviews of all the work that was done. And everyone's interpretation of the work was totally different from, like, one person that saw it to another person. And I think that's the beauty of, like, abstraction and potentially live and performance art, where you actually give an audience the freedom to interpret what it is that they're seeing. It's quite different, I think, to theatre and potentially dance works, where there's not necessarily contemporary dance, but dance in general can be a bit didactic and narrative-like, particularly ballets and very traditional type of dancing. And so I like to sort of skew that sort of element of people's perceptions of understanding of what, you know, what they're seeing. And, you know, that can be either hit or miss. And I think that's just what I do. I'm either a hit or miss sort of artist. People either understand or they don't, and that's fine. I think that's actually really exciting. And I think, you know, for someone that, you know, I'm not that long in my career, I would probably consider myself a mid-career artist, not emerging anymore. But for someone, you know, to have that sort of element of, you know, level of engagement of an audience where it's either loathed or liked, I think is quite exciting. And who knows what the future can bring from here on. Yeah.
In previous conversations, you talked about dissociation. How do you feel that guides the work you create? Any new works you are planning for next year?
Yeah, dissociation is interesting. Potentially, when I first was diagnosed with elements of it, it was sort of not fully understood what it was. And I think for me, it's always been, I suppose, an element of who I am. And I think, like, for me, the work I am making at the moment comes from this, and it comes from a place that, you know, not a lot of the people can access, and it's not necessarily a thing that people would, you know, understand or, you know, be wary of. Yeah. And so it looks like we might be having a break. Is that cool?
Welcome to Ritters.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think dissociation is, for me, it's two things. It's an understanding of where I'm originally from. And I think this comes a lot from the very alien and isolating elements of my work that are reflected in what I do. And also it's also potentially another reality that exists in our world that we don't necessarily see. And I feel like that's something that I give audiences. I give audiences a different reality in which they can view the world, and they're open up. They are open to this possibility of seeing something that is not necessarily in full view of, you know, their own reality as well. So I like to sort of tip the balance of reality and non-reality a lot in what I do.
Josh,
Have you got some good moments performing with Touch Compass when you were in New Zealand?
So what was that question again, Lucy? I just sort of didn't catch that Touch Compass. Yeah, I was just thinking today how long ago it was, and I think it was 2015 when I was at Touch Compass. And yeah, it was a long time ago for me, potentially because now it just seems like a world away from what I did, what I'm doing now. Sorry. I mean, that was what I was potentially interested in at the time, was trying to make a career in a company life, and it was a really great opportunity. But I think, like, you know, performing in a company and being involved in that sort of life made me realize that that's not what I want to do. And so I was sort of spurred on to do more independent works after that. And I think it also opened up a possibility of just also meeting different people. Like I met like quite a different, quite different artists in New Zealand over where you are. And so I've kept in touch with a few of them. And I think that's just like another, you know, I suppose, you know, relationship that we can establish with different artists throughout the world. Yeah.
My turn. Okay, great. Joshua, I'm really curious to know what inspires you. I mean, you've talked a little bit about some of those things, but yeah, I'd love to hear more about what inspires your work, because you obviously have a really strong passion.
I think what inspires me is many things. Before the pandemic, I used to read a lot, and so often like images and words and pictures that were built up from, you know, novels and things would often inspire me. But also I think it's a lot to do with the conversations I have with the entities and, you know, non-human and human collaborators. I often get inspired from that. And so, as I think I mentioned to you, there was a work I was sort of looking at doing where I inadvertently was collaborating with someone that had passed, and they gave me this information about where they were initially, where they were sort of like working or living at the time, and then eventually where they passed away. And so that became this interesting sort of conversation where it wasn't necessarily a conversation, it became this sort of feeling of like, oh, there's something weird about where I'm, this particular spot where I always end up when we did this particular process as part of this residency I was involved in Sydney. And I kept on coming to this certain spot and I couldn't work out why. And then eventually doing my own research, I worked out, oh, it's actually someone that's passed and they used to frequent this area quite a lot. And then at the end of the residency, I ended up going towards where they were actually found. And so it became this sort of interesting conversation, I think, between, you know, someone that wasn't here, but is, I suppose, still here. And I think that became an inspiration for the work that I was supposed to then make at a residency in Brisbane. And we'll also be sort of touching on in another work next year, this idea of people that have gone missing, but also potentially having a voice through you as to what's happened to them. And so that's one inspiration. And then there's other multiple inspirations. Some of my, like, I suppose, human inspirations have been David Lynch. So Twin Peaks was a massive obsession of mine when I was growing up, if everyone can remember that. I just found he was so courageous to make the work he made at the time, and especially on national TV. I thought that was pretty amazing to actually have a series like that on national TV. It was, you know, amazing to, you know, even have networks want that as well. So I thought that was quite a watershed moment for that particular period of time. And also I'm quite influenced by certain other artists that I've collaborated with or who I've known over the years. So one of my big inspirations has been S.J. Norman, who is based, S.J. Norman, who's based here in Australia. And he's sort of been a massive influence of mine over the past sort of 2-3 years since we became collaborators. And also, I suppose, other artists that I've been come in contact with over the years as well. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So you seem to be really interested in exploring this sort of veil between different worlds. Would that be correct?
Yeah, definitely. I think like growing up, there was a sense of like not really identifying with the world in which I was in. I think that's definitely been a big part of my journey, and sort of understanding and coming to terms with the alienness of who I am. And that's fine. I mean, that's not a problem. I don't see that as a problem at all. I think it's actually quite an amazing gift, really, to give to other people as well. And so I think that's definitely, you know, has affected the work I make, where I often invite audiences into very surreal alien landscapes. And rather than sort of, as I said, give them a narrative, it's sort of left up to them to interpret what goes on. And also, that has also informed a lot of the ritual practice, where the ability to enter into a world that is not necessarily seen has to really demand a lot of you as a person, and to a point of like really intense listening, intense sort of even, I suppose, visualizing what that is. So imagination, I suppose, can play a really big part in what I do, particularly, I suppose, with regards to audiences, where I do really try to give them that real big sense of their imagination, sort of being able to understand, interpret what's going on as what they're viewing in front of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have another question, Lucy? So I'm really interested, you know, you talk about the non-human and, you know, and that being part of the sort of the discourse, you know, can you elaborate more on that? Are you talking about the natural environment, or?
Yeah, it's definitely a natural environment sort of conversation, but also it's also when I talk about non-human, I probably should rephrase that. It's potentially the real non-human, like the people that you see physically in front of you. So it's also the ephemeral sort of humans that sort of coexist in our world that we don't necessarily see or hear. And also, I suppose, non-human can also be those myths and legends that we hear about as well, that I feel is still part of our world and still here. And so that's also a really big part of the discourse I have in regards to the work I make and the people that I collaborate with. And sometimes it's just about trying to get them to understand it, and understand it in their terms and the context in which they come from. Because not everyone has, I suppose, I often call it a spiritual awakening, which is probably the best way to describe it. And I think that's definitely come from a lot of my upbringing. Like I was not raised, but I was sort of schooled in a Catholic school. So it became, you know, I think that really affected the work I make. And also, when I left the Catholic school, I then went into a Pentecostal Christian school. So that was even a more intense situation for some people, depending on how you look at it. And so I think that's really definitely made some sort of impact in the work I've made, and potentially in the way that I live my life as well. Like I feel like I'm on a very spiritual quest, a journey, if you wish, of like trying to understand the world, where I am in the world, and where I fit in this world. And I think, you know, it sort of becomes a sort of, as I spoke to someone the other day, it becomes like a lifestyle as opposed to a practice. So you're constantly involved in this sort of ongoing quest, spiritual journey that doesn't really, it sort of has a friction with today's society, especially the way that we live now, where it's really hectic, really overwhelming. And in my own job outside the arts, where it's in pharmacy, it's really hard to actually go on a spiritual journey when you're totally involved in the mechanics of capitalism, the way that things are running, constant sort of push towards consumption, just like over the top. And the pandemic's actually brought so much over the top life of like over the top sort of, I suppose, way that we live, that it's become so hard to actually, engage in the spiritual quest and the spiritual understanding. And so it becomes this almost resistance to the way that we are at the moment. So I feel that what I'm doing is almost like a resistance to the way things are, and trying to resist that.
Is it a resistance or is it in conversation?
It was interesting, it's definitely a resistance, because it feels, when I talk about the resistance, it's a resistance in terms of resisting against the way that things are. So trying to not go to that way that we operate. And so you are constantly in this sort of resistance of trying to be in this spiritual realm, but the world itself is not at that point. And so the resistance is between the world as it is and where you are. And so I think that's where I'm talking about the resistance. It's definitely that conversation though between the spirit and yourself, and how that sort of manifests in the work that you make, and also in what you do in everyday life. But for definitely, when it became really clear to me when I was in a situation where I was overworking myself, it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago now, where I was vaccinating, I think it was 20 people within a space of like 3 hours, I think it was. And there were people that wanted me to go faster. And I thought, well, no, I'm not going to go faster. I'm actually going to take my time on this, because it's actually a really serious matter. It's potentially a life and death situation here for some people. So I can't go faster. And so I resisted that urge for people to actually meet that demand. And so for me, that's also this element of resistance, is that the quality that the spiritual nature has and is not in relation to the way that we operate. You have to resist going back to those ways. I know it's interesting how the world has not resisted that, how we've all just sort of like gone straight forward into the cavern of like normality, back to the way things are. And it seems that we've almost had this bottleneck effect, where we're like trying to push ourselves out, but not really getting anywhere. And yeah, I think if we all had that element of like just learning to listen, be more present, then, we might eventually get somewhere. But it feels like the way that, I suppose, the vaccine sort of given this sort of, I suppose, holy grail of going back to where we were. And that sort of is everyone's answer for everything. And it's an interesting time that we're living in, particularly. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess, people are seeking some kind of, normality, and
yeah, totally. Yeah.
You're not seeking that normality at all.
No, I think
you're seeking something quite different from that. So, being in the pandemic at the moment, how does that inform your work particularly? You've sort of brushed that a little bit, but could you expand on that a little bit? You know, how that's informing your work?
Yeah.
Could we just swap interpreters before you begin again, Josh?
No worries.
Thank you.
Had time to think about it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the pandemic has definitely affected my work. It's made it, how to describe it? It's made it, I've got ideas more about durational work now. And I think it's related to the fact that this whole vaccination process is actually quite a durational exercise, particularly when you are vaccinating and in the throes of actually doing that. And so you often need to be completely, well, ideally completely involved in that process would be great. But as it stands, the way that sometimes pharmacies operate, that's not always possible. You're often pulled away from that to do something else and so forth. And so for me, duration, it's always been a big part of my work, but I think for now, the pandemic has really made this investigation much more interesting and more richer, especially with this element of like duration under duress, potentially would be interesting to explore in the future, and how that also has to, in terms of what you're doing, especially when you're vaccinating, how there's 100% accuracy within that duress and durational exercise that you're performing with somebody, and that you can't sort of, I suppose, fuck it up is the best way to describe it. You have to be correct and 100% accurate, but then at the same time you are in situations where there is potential for fuck ups to happen because of the way that we operate, and so it's an interesting sort of dynamic between trying to be 100% accurate, but at the same time being thrown these curveballs all the time of like having that ability to actually make these mistakes. And so how do you, in this situation, still be able to then allow that 100% accuracy to then evolve? And so it becomes a sort of interesting choreography in a way that is interesting, because I've never really been interested in I wasn't the sort of dancer that would sort of do everything 100% accurate. But in this situation, you need to be 100% accurate. You can't sort of cut corners. You can't do anything, you know, you can't improvise in this manner. It's actually this sort of thing of like, there's no room for error in this sort of situation. And so I think, you know, this sort of
much more anxiety as now this pandemic has affected the normality.
What was the question? That sort of missed the first.
That's interesting. I think it's much more anxiety as now this pandemic has affected the normality. Yeah,
I definitely feel there's an anxiety that everyone feels, and I particularly have felt that over the last probably year, 2 years, where potentially the anxiety initially for me was about like going out, being able to be one of the very few, I suppose, privileged people to enter the world that would sort of had happened after COVID, but then also being extremely anxious about the world itself and the protection that you had, which was very minimal at the time, particularly in pharmacy, where we didn't have any sort of protections against anything, and we still operated the way that we operated. And then thankfully over time, the distancing became more of a thing, and still is a thing, but yeah, like it's the anxiety, I think, has now been replaced has now moved on to this vaccination situation where the anxiety is now about like, oh my gosh, like you've got, like we've never really been in a position of administering things. It's very rare generally for pharmacists to administer things. We usually give them out and then you yourself will administer those or whatever it is that we give you. And it's interesting, like the only time we administer things, the level of risk involved is quite intense. And I think about the time that we do administer things is actually in sort of the methadone program. I don't know if you probably have that same thing over in where you are. And the level of risk involved is quite astronomical, especially the way that they've sort of developed the syrup that you make, where even the potential like giving 1 ml is a deadly situation. And so the level of risk in terms of administering in that situation is almost comparable to what's happening now. And yeah, it's an interesting, I suppose, dynamic that I think will definitely inform the work I make in the future. I can't think how it wouldn't. Especially being so intimately involved in the way that, I even have vials at home of empty vaccines that it's all like, in looking at me and like informing me, and I had like the remnants of that, that I drew up about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so it's this constant sort of presence that's around me, particularly now that's pretty much, I feel like that's all I'm doing is just drawing up this vaccine and being intimately involved in the way that it's drawn up, the way the color of the vaccine, the solution, what's in it, and then also giving it to someone. The way that the needle goes into the skin and you pull it out, and sometimes there's blood and sometimes there's not. It can be a bit of a lucky dip sometimes, depending on how you see it. It's just a fascinating time, really. And it's, who would have thought that would affect, will affect, or potentially will, I think it will affect what I'm doing in the future.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. As someone who likes to move between these different realms, and is quite comfortable, almost like in different states of consciousness, you've kind of alluded to that throughout the discussion. And you just talked about our current environment where there's this high anxiety around well-being. And health, and also I think when we're talking about boundaries and fluidness, like there's a lot of anxiety around our bodily boundaries, and what's inside and what's outside. And I think normally we're sort of trucking along and we've got quite a clear sense of my bodily boundary and it's quite safe. But now it's not, because we can, I mean, it's always been the case, but now it's exaggerated that we can breathe or we can take in, our bodily boundaries are being challenged or potentially jeopardized by, other agents that are out there. So I guess what I'm really curious about is the sense that, we are in exchange with the environment, and so those boundaries are really unclear now, and there seems to be massive anxiety around that. What's inside, what's outside, and where am I safe, where am I not safe? I just wondered if you had any kind of artistic reflection around that, as someone who is really comfortable with moving
between boundaries,
between those veils. And I'm sort of trying to draw a few different strands here together.
It made me think of the conversation we were having before we came on about how in another version of that, how, you know, even though COVID is a thing, people's bodily autonomy in terms of like taking a vaccination has now been mandated in most of the parts of the world. And so, yeah, like the idea of, like, as you said, like going through life without having to really, you know, not necessarily take a medicine if you don't want, or, you know, not take something or not be given something, has now been put into question. And that's an interesting scenario in terms of like it also being a veil, not a veil, but also being this sort of essentialness of like being able to protect and to also let others live their lives within the frame of where we are at this point in time. And so it's, you know, moving between these worlds has, I suppose, a similar connotation, because that can also be quite confronting for people. And particularly where this has happened before, where I've been accused of witchcraft and so forth. Yeah. That often happens a lot. It's because of the understanding of like what that is, and, you know, that you generally don't go into these boundaries.
Your artistic perspective and your ways.
Sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
I sense you are comfortable in your artistic perspective and your ways.
Yeah, yes, definitely. I feel that there's definitely comfortability that exists in what I do. Initially, when I first started doing it, it was very foreign to me, because I'd never really done anything like this before, because I'd sort of always, I suppose, my initial sort of journey started out as a dancer. But even before that, I was sort of very much a visual person as well. And so I think elements of the two sort of combined into this thing that now is called performance art or live art, for people to know a category. And so, yeah, like I think, like, as I said before, like it's, lost my train of thought now, I was thinking about. There's this sense of these boundaries being too difficult for people to comprehend, potentially when you go into these real dark and, I suppose, disturbing and also unknown places. Our world doesn't necessarily celebrate that at all. And especially in the disability community, often we're often taught that we need to see the light at the end of the tunnel. There is no way that you are able to even comprehend being in a dark place, because that's not healthy for you. And it's interesting, the health and also like the aspect comes back in again to this whole conversation, like how that's healthy. And for me, particularly with regards to ritual practitioners and the people I've spoken to, especially when they do these sort of practices, you do need to go to those darker places. There's no way that you can't. It's about facing your shadow and being able to accept that as as part of you. It's not a separate part of you, it's who you are. We all have a darker side, and it's about like accepting and also confronting and also meeting that place, you know, and being comfortable with it. And I think that's something that our world generally doesn't always understand. And particularly, as I said, in the community, we're taught to actually try to overcome this. This is another thing that we need to overcome.
What do we have to overcome?
The darkness.
The darkness.
The darkness. Yeah, the darkness, or the there's always this thing to try to find the lighter side of things, find the comedic side.
Okay, Josh?
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
As I said, there's always this sense of like us trying to overcome or try to find the comedic or light side of things. We don't necessarily celebrate a more, I suppose, not dark, but I suppose that's the way that people see it, the dark or the disturbing or the I suppose the less unknown element of life. And I think my work gives people that experience, and that's why I feel it can be quite provocative and polarizing as well, where people find that it becomes, they either love it or they hate it. Yeah.
So it sort of pushes people into unfamiliar places.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Can you describe some of your recent works?
Yeah, like the most recent work, which toured quite considerably, like here in Australia, and also to once New York, was a work I made for Next Wave called Jupiter Orbiting. And it was a co-commission with a place called PICA, the Perth Institute of Contemporary Arts here in Orlu in Perth. And it sort of came off the back of another work that I made, which was called Monster, back in 2016, I think it was. And that was my first foray into this sort of world of where I now reside, I suppose. And that was a really intense experience because it was also produced by quite, I suppose, an organisation that wouldn't really produce something like that. And so I think they were taking a risk along with, you know, me taking a risk working with them. And so there was a lot of risk involved, I felt, in the work that I made, particularly as it wasn't really a work that would sort of be in the, I suppose, in the touring category of where this organisation sort of, you know, potentially look at placing the work. It was quite a very esoteric work, I would probably put it, in the sense of like it's probably understood by only a certain few members of the population. And that was like a really big moment for me where I felt almost like an unboundable freedom in being able to do this, and being also the capacity to do it. So that for me then led to the other work which I made, which also had its own issues, especially with the first development when we first made it. I remember after I'd finished the showing of the work, me and the other person that was involved, we'd finished, and all I could hear, because at the end of the work, it's basically me in a white jumpsuit with makeup on my face, and I'm like throwing confetti, eating confetti, stuffing confetti down in my jumpsuit, being really manic, and, you know, it was a psychedelic moment, real pure psychedelic moment. And so we had this fan on that sort of rotates. I remember like the way that we exit the work is we go behind the curtain. And me and the other person behind the curtain, we couldn't hear a sound, only the fan rotating and silence, literal just silence. And we thought, oh my God, what have we done? Like, it was probably the most scariest moments of my performance career. I was like, oh my gosh, have I actually, you know, fucked the audience or something? Like, it was just totally scary. And we came out, and it was so funny because like I was so like nervous, like I didn't even have much of a voice to even say anything to anybody. And it was funny because like one of the comments that was made about like when we got the feedback was they actually thought the performance was still going when I came out and said, oh, we'd like you to then have a drink with us in the bar at the you know, the place that we presented the work. And they actually thought it was part of this performance because they said this strange creature crawled out and was sort of like inaudibly talking to us about something. And they actually thought that was part of the performance. They found it quite interesting. And so, I mean, this is like the sort of thing that happens in some of the work I make, where reality of like, you know, when the thing finishes potentially isn't what the reality is. It could potentially be part of the performance as well. And so I like to blur the edges of like, you know, what ends and what begins in the performance as well. So often my work will start before people come in, and they're sort of met in an encounter of whatever's happening at that point. And potentially the ending may not even end. It may continue on and on and on. And so yeah, I think like being able to be in that element of I suppose total freedom of what you can do is really quite rewarding and rich. Yeah.
I think
Thanks, Joshua, much for your time to chat with us, and please come back to work with us someday soon. Go
I'd
well.
love to. Thank you.
and I think we can questions.
Questions?
Oh,
good.
Questions,
Oh
but yeah, thank you so much.
well, thank you. Thank you.
It's fascinating.
So we already have a few great questions from the chat, and the first is, how did you make the leap from dance to performance art?
Yeah, I think for me the leap was made mainly via a collaboration I had, which unfortunately is no longer here. And it was working with a visual artist, and I suppose their influence. But I also feel in many ways I was sort of doing what I was doing anyway, but in a way that, in a dancey manner. Because I think like in dance, there still is this very strong directive and desire for dancers to be in uniformity and in total unison with each other, even in like, outside of, say, able-bodiedness, even in, I suppose, companies that have, disabled and non-disabled dancers working together. I felt there was definitely some sort of uniformity or unison that would always be directed towards what we were doing. And for me, it was always against what I've always known as part of my life. I've never really gone with the uniformity or the convention of what you should do. And so it was always, why do we have to do that? Like, it's art. Art should just be, a broad sort of freedom, or some sort of, something that's beyond just the didactic and the uniformity and the bland, really, for me. And so I was always in trouble for not being in unison or not being in time or whatever. And I was like, just don't give a shit. It's just, and eventually, when it became independent, I just thought, I can do this. I can do whatever I like in a way. And so, I think that became a real big diving point into this world of performance art, but also definitely with collaborations that I had prior to that. And also I think it was another point that I think of in terms of where that came from was a residency I did in 2016 at Critical Path. That was a really big turning point for me in terms of like understanding my practice and where it potentially may lead to. Yeah.
Awesome.
Amazing. We've got another question in the chat being messaged. Culture is both deeply rooted and constantly evolving. How does your culture inform where you can take your performance art?
Yeah, interesting. I think like the idea of culture, particularly from an Indigenous perspective, is a constant conversation that's evolving, and because it's such the history here is so, it's quite, to put it a better word, it's really not the best in terms of like maintenance, cultural maintenance, because a lot of us were told, especially early on after settlement, that we couldn't practice our culture, that it was bringing spirits or whatever, or there's always some reason why you can't do it. And then eventually the idea of the stolen generation, where you're taken away from your culture, literally taken away from your family, that community, that network, and then placed into I suppose, the desirable culture that we should be practicing. So it's interesting, like I feel like we're sort of in this midst of like understanding what our culture is. And particularly in like a 21st century situation where, you know, what culture was back then doesn't necessarily apply to what culture is now. And it almost felt like back when I was sort of, I suppose, I always knew I was, well, actually, no, I didn't really know I was Aboriginal. That's another story to be told, and it's too long to really tell it. But, you know, when I was sort of in those communities and sort of in the sort of networks, it almost felt like I need to be initiated to understand my culture. And I thought, well, why do I need to be initiated? Like, I never really grew up like that. And it's really weird that I feel I need to do that. And I think that's a conversation a lot of us, particularly that are in that situation where we don't necessarily understand our culture or haven't been brought up in a cultural sort of situation, where we're trying to, like, I suppose, work it out. And for me, another big part and practice of this is the understanding of the DNA and how the DNA always provides you with those answers. And also the visions that you need as part of who you are culturally. Yeah.
There's a couple more questions. There's been a few questions coming in. I think we've got time for a couple more. The arts are full of wow experiences. Is there anything you've experienced in the last few years that have just made you go, wow?
We'll just swap interpreters, please. Thank you. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, probably one of the most wow, and I hate to use that word, wow, experiences was when I was in New York and I was in the same building as S.J. Norman's work, Cicatrix, and I was actually involved in that work. And I mean, it's one of those works that I think will always remain with you even after you've finished or performed it, particularly with SJ, because they've actually got the remnants of the work. Without going into too much detail, I mean, you can look it up yourself, but it involved incisions being made on the back. And it was in relation to a situation here where we've got deaths in custodies. And it sort of brought on quite a potentially negative response from some members of the community here in regards to the work. But being involved in something like that, where an artist almost like gives themselves over to total obedience, is probably the best way to put it, was such a powerful moment for me. And that's definitely a wow in my, I'll probably never forget that work till the day I die, really, especially when I was involved in that. But witnessing that and seeing that, I think, has really affected and interestingly, I've actually transformed me from where I was at that point in time to where I am now. That was definitely, I suppose, a wow moment. There's other, potential wow moments, but I mean, for me, that's probably the most clear example of, I suppose, something that I would consider go wow. And everyone else that was in that room to this day still feels that presence of I suppose, the enormity of what was happening in that room. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Lucy and Suzanne, do you think we've got time for one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll pull one more from the chat. There's so many. Your work being performance art and based around ritual and duration, how is it communicating with producers, with the actual venues when you want to put your works on and they don't have that tight framework that other works maybe have?
It is hard. I think that's a hard conversation, and it's an interesting conversation as well. Because I think a lot of organisations, particularly now, are looking at a decolonial sort of framework. And for me, I feel this definitely decolonizes a lot of what we expect in a performance without really going to that, I suppose, the indigeneity aspect of what decolonial is. It just decolonizes all aspects of like what we consider a performance to be, like from where it starts to where it ends, what audiences do, what the expectation of the audience is. And, you know, like, it's interesting how that they're really hungry for it, but when they potentially see something like that, they're not always going to grab it because it's a bit like confronting, because it's not really, and I'm not sort of trying to fix on myself regarding this, but it does feel like it can be quite confronting for these organizations to see something like that when they see the true product of what that is. Because I have been told that my work does really decolonize a lot of what we expect in a performance, and potentially, like, I suppose, what we have been, you know, used to in a performance space and environment and experience. And I think it's an interesting conversation, because somewhere along the line, performance has felt that an audience is of the utmost importance, in the sense of like almost the work is made for them. And I look at other aspects of art where that's not necessarily the case, and it's often usually the artist or the artist's inspiration that's made the work, and we haven't necessarily tried to fit it into an audience framework. So yeah, I don't know, like, I think producers, there's some producers that understand the work, and then there's others that even the more, I suppose, experimental producers or organizations or you know, festivals sometimes have a hard grasp of what I do as well. So yeah, I think it's just about having that conversation with people, and sometimes you have to really be quite clear, and that can sometimes be a bit annoying, but you know, it's, I don't know, like, I don't know really how to answer that question, because I think it's more about like that question or those provocations going to the producers themselves, and about how they would potentially deal with this, as opposed to, I feel, me trying to do the work for them. That being, if I was to be so bold as to say that, it just, you know, I feel like in many ways that's something that they need to have a conversation with, about like how would, and if they did want to, how would they program this work and how would they do it, and you know, is that something that they want to do in the first place?
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting answer, Joshua. I must say, as a producer, I'm like, yes, we do need to do the work. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. So thank you so much, Joshua, for joining us in this conversation. Thank you so much, Lucy and Suzanne, for being our hosts and our guides today. If anyone's interested in getting a recording of this sent to them, in a couple of days, we'll have everything kind of downloaded and ready to go, and we'll be able to share some stuff. Keep an eye on our Facebook and our Instagram. If you have any questions about anything we talked about today, feel free to chuck me an email, producer@touchcompass.org.nz, and I'll help direct your question to where it needs to go. But in the meantime, I will give the last words to the three of you, if you have anything you want to add before we close out for the afternoon.
Oh, yeah, thanks so much. Lauren says, thanks so much for this wonderful conversation, practice and perspective, Joshua.
Oh, thank you, Lauren.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah, I found it really fascinating, and it's definitely stimulated my own thinking around my own practice, and yeah, so it's been very provocative.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And also really interesting too, from a disability perspective, you know, I think we sort of touched on some of those overlaps with, you know, your artwork and, you know, the current environment and disability, how they sort of weave together, you know, the intersections between those elements. And I thought that was really fascinating. So, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, please, let's keep in touch because, yeah.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
About the dog.
Yeah.
Can relate to what you just said about the dog.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. Yeah.
Bring it on.
Bring it on.
Yeah.
I'll be bringing it on.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Okay.
Well, once again, thank you all so much. And to close out our webinar today, our General Manager again, John, will lead us in a closing karakia.
Kia ora all, and echo the sentiments of everyone here. That Josh, just beautiful, enlightening, provoking, from provocateur to provocative to provoking. You're all of those and more. And thanks so much for sharing your thoughts, your whakaaro, your hinanaro with us today. It was beautiful. I'll just close us with a quick karakia to end. Kia whakaere te tapu, kia wātea te ara, kia tūriki whakataa ai, kia tūriki whakataa ai, haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e. That which restricts us is removed. The pathway is now open for us to return to our everyday activities, allied, together as one. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Yeah.
Ah.
Keep in touch.
Cool. It's just us now. It's just TC people. So again, thank you so much, Joshua. That was really, really provocative and interesting. And
thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, and I'm so interested in like the place. You know, one of my favorite works I've seen in the last 6 months was S.J. Norman's tarot deck, or sorry, was it a set of deities that they made?
They made for another artist. Yeah. Deborah. I don't know
yes.
her name.
Yes.
Deborah, yeah.
Oh,